Hello, everyone. I'm Norman Chen, CEO of the Asian American Foundation, or TAAF. Thank you for joining us for the first TAAF Talk of 2024. We plan to host one per quarter, so please make sure to join our monthly newsletter and follow us on social at TAAF.org to learn more. In today's TAAF Talk, we'll discuss innovating in the fight against anti-AAPI hate with some incredible experts. For those that have been following us since our launch in 2021, thank you and welcome back. For those who are new in the audience, TAAF was launched by community and business leaders in response to the historic rise in hate and violence against our community. Our unwavering mission is to advocate for greater safety and belonging for the 24 million AANHPIs in this country because hate against our community is still ever present, even though these incidents have faded from the headlines. According to our status index research, 1 in 2 AAPIs feel unsafe in at least one type of public space, including public transportation, at school, and in their own neighborhoods. Along with our dedicated community partners, we are committed to pursuing immediate and long-term solutions to fight anti-Asian hate. We develop solutions shaped by our holistic 2R3P framework: response, recovery, protection, prevention, and policy. Our growing anti-hate national network, which currently consists of over 45 partners, including the New York City Anti-Hate Collaborative, provides local, on-the-ground, and culturally appropriate resources to over 40% of AANHPIs in this country. Our strong local partners, like those on the panel today, provide essential, direct services, safety, and healing to our communities, and share best practices across the network. We look forward to working with you to empower our communities to feel safe, to feel like we truly belong and are accepted, and to have every opportunity to thrive. I would like to now introduce you to CeFaan Kim, ABC New York correspondent and reporter, who is our moderator for today's TAAF Talk. CeFaan?
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, take two. Norman, thank you so much. It's a pleasure and honor to be here with you all. My name is CeFaan Kim with ABC7 Eyewitness News here in New York. From so many of these anti-Asian hate incidents, as we know, emerged during that year out of New York, but we all know that it's not confined to New York, and I always argue that anti-Asian hate, anti-Asian bias did not begin in 2020, and thus it does not end in 2021. The reason why it was an awakening, the reason why it was a movement, the reason why so many AAPI related and connected to these incidents is because we've all had some experience with it that far predates 2020, meaning it's systemic. And so in order to change the system, we need agents of change who work within the system. And so with that said, we have 4 esteemed guests with us today who are part of that system. And without further ado, so we can get to some substantive topics here, let me introduce our panelists today. We have Ju Han. She's the Deputy Director of the Asian American Federation here in New York City. Unfortunately, I have too much familiarity with you, Ju. Welcome back. Julia Liou is the Chief Executive Officer of Asian Health Services in Oakland, California, another hotbed for anti-Asian incidents we've seen. Paul Liou is the Chief Executive Officer of Chinese American Service League in Chicago, Illinois. A little demographic diversity here. And Harman Singh, who is the co-interim executive director of the Sikh Coalition. It's a national organization headquartered in New York City. Also, unfortunately, I know too much about this organization. And as I started out the outset, it is systemic. We are seeing, even though not so many headlines on anti-Asian hate and bias, we're seeing different bias incidents increase, right? As of late, between Israel and Palestine, we're seeing incidents around there. LGBTQ anti-bias incidents are up in the past year or two. And as Harman Singh would know, after 9/11, history repeats itself. So here we are again. So with that said, I want to begin with Julia. Julia, your organization's been doing some pretty important work. It's the kind of stuff that we often are sort of careful to delve into, but let's be honest, it's critical work and it's important work. The overall approach that you're taking to address anti-AAPI hate, in particular between the Black and Asian communities, there's a lot of dynamics there at play. Public health approach, mental health counseling. Can you talk to us about what the organization has done, how to approach it?
Yeah, thank you, CeFaan. We are a community health center that provides medical, dental, and behavioral healthcare services to 50,000 patients in 12 Asian languages. And as a health center, we recognize that racism is a public health issue. And so we have come with this belief that when one community is affected, that we are all affected. And so that we believe that everyone has the right to heal from trauma and feel safe in their community. And so that's why we launched, with support of TAAF, an Asian Black Racial Trauma Project. And so the goals really are to surface the underpinnings of racism and conflict, because we so often get pitted against each other. And so what we've done is we partnered with West Oakland Health Council, a sister community health clinic focused on providing care and services for the African American community. And so together we've actually embarked on a research project, bringing together our patients from both Asian and Black backgrounds and our communities to really understand what are the real tensions, but also the areas that we need to go deeper to identify the interventions that really can help foster and deepen relationship and partnership. The goal really is to inform a development of a training toolkit for mental health professionals, because oftentimes mental health professionals are not trained to address racism and Asian Black race relations, and really to inform efforts to shift the narrative around violence as a public health issue, because we want to be able to support more Asian Black collaboration. And so to that end, what we have done is we've established very important partnerships, including organizing joint food distributions for our Asian and our Black communities. In recognition, we both face food insecurity post-COVID. We also have come together to celebrate Lunar New Year and Black History Month. So it is about creating intentional shared space, because we have to promote that learning, the solidarity, and close the distance between our communities. I think it's recognizing that our oppressions really are connected to each other, and it's important for us to be able to listen to the stories from perspectives of our patients and really sit with that discomfort, and understand that there's a lot of nuances in the stories and experiences, because right now it's all about the media, but really we're taking our patient stories and using those to ground us and to really recognize the humanity in it all.
So the food bank thing, I'm going to drill in on this because that sounds remarkable, because now you're sort of highlighting shared struggles, right? Some of this tension comes from this misperception that AAPI communities don't have the same struggles, right? Food insecurity is an obvious common denominator, and then you're sort of taking that common denominator and you're now putting it into action. There must also be so much conversation that comes around just a table when you're eating. I'm sure that fosters so much. I guess my question to you is, of all the things that you do to foster and nurture and build bridges, would that be the one program that you're seeing a lot of I guess, promise in?
Yeah, I think it's really became a very organic thing that we saw that there was this need. There were both Asians and African-American community members who were really actually seeking, a need for food from the food banks. And so we started creating these events. Again, it's really just exposure to each other, being able to close that distance and interact, and then also understand sometimes the nuances because of language barriers, or, again, it was just the opportunity to come together in a different way and in a very organic way. So I think that now, as we continue to do our focus groups and our research, we are going to be putting out more of a toolkit, again, to drive really what are some of these nuances that have been developed because of mistrust or, again, misunderstandings, and just being able to dig a little bit deeper. But I do think that opportunity to create shared space and have intention really is a very, very important step.
Before I move into Paul, I do want to ask one follow-up here. So you mentioned how you're looking for what's the root of these tensions. I know you don't have the answer for everything here, but would it be safe to assume that some of this root of the tension is the misunderstanding that AAPI communities have some of these shared struggles? Is there other things you're finding?
Yeah, I think oftentimes it's so hard because the media builds that narrative, right? That also puts us and pits us against each other. And so we have to go through and break down those, again, narratives. And it comes in nuance because there's sometimes misunderstandings. Because again, if you know, sometimes we've got, all the grandmas who are trying to get the food and sort of pushing through, but really understanding where does that come from? That doesn't mean that this is because you're trying to, get ahead. It's really because maybe from your history and your background as an immigrant, that was about survival. So I think, again, it's these sort of nuanced aspects that we are really trying to surface and really sort of push forward and really help to create and bridge that understanding between both our communities.
Awesome, awesome stuff. Love it. Paul, on to you. Chicago, big city. Chicago is a big Chinatown. It's large. But in your experience, what has it been like working with other AAPI communities? And there's lots of them in Chicago and other communities to address anti-Asian hate, healing circles, things like that. What are you finding there in Chicago?
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me. I really want to piggyback just really quickly like what Julia said about the food program. CASL here is one of the largest API organizations in the Midwest, and I want to piggyback that. It's so important about the Black and Brown and the Asian American community. During COVID, our Asian American seniors were actually struggling to eat because of the hate crime, because they're feared to walk out. And so CASL pivot to create a culturally appropriate meal program for free. And we're feeding so many different buildings, affordable housing for seniors. But what we also discovered is because of the tension in our community, Black community seniors were also hungry and starving. And so because we're all equal, everyone needs to eat. And because how it's divided through media, through hate narratives and rhetorics, those Black and Hispanic seniors didn't approach us. And so we went out and reached out to them and provided hot, culturally appropriate meals for these buildings. And today we're feeding hundreds and hundreds of seniors the meals. So allowing us and both communities to join in an effort to say that it's just not Asian Americans who are struggling, but also Black and Brown communities too. So I just really want to pivot on that because it's really critical because it's one little nuance as our organization, like Julia's organization, when we work across lines and able to communicate, understand everyone has the same struggles, we'll get able to support each other. So sorry about that. I just want to add that really quickly.
Good, segue. So I have a question. You said that we, started to service some of these Black and Brown folks, right? Was that the first time, and maybe you heard anecdotally from them, that they've ever experienced an AAPI nonprofit reaching out to them?
Correct. And it's because they saw the word Chinese American service slave, right? And so we needed as an organization, one, to amplify our message that we're here to service not just the API community, but anyone in need, right? We have the means, we have the ability to support that. So once we approach them, many of the families, and adult families and seniors say, oh my goodness, we thought it was only for the Chinese community, let alone the API community. And second, are you serving Asian American food? And it's like, no, we serve a culturally appropriate food. Now, throughout the years, and we're providing Asian American food, many of our Black and Brown seniors are now saying, we want our noodles, we want our rice. And so it allows us to connect. Exactly. It allows us to connect to other communities using food as a bridge to other communities so that we can also educate them, not just about food and security in their community, but their rights on employment, healthcare, benefits, and so on. So we are now using that tool as a mobile to get to other communities.
Right. So in your opinion, would it be fair to assume that up until you had an AAPI nonprofit reaching out to them, they probably had this misperception that, hey, they only care about them. We got to look out for us, which ultimately just drives the division. Would you say that this has gone a long way in fostering and building that bridge?
Absolutely. And we know, and many of you may know, Chicago is one of the most segregated community city in the country. Yeah. We have neighborhoods that just really states this is only people who live here versus people who live here. And that adds on to the rhetorics of that divide. And it's really difficult, but we use this project and this initiative to build those bridges. So because of that, we now have federal funding, and we secured our first $1 million from the federal government to help increase not just food insecurity, but continue to build bridges across the city of Chicago.
Let me end with one last follow-up here. So, decades, I'm older than I look, before my anti-Asian hate coverage, I've always been spotlighting the poverty and food insecurity issue in the AAPI community, because frankly, it's an untold story, narrative in the media, mainstream media in particular. But I would imagine that is not something that most mainstream American folks, non-AAPI, even up until recently, AAPI folks were aware of. The question to you is, would it be safe to say that most of these folks outside the AAPI community had no clue as to what these common struggles and shared struggles were until that outreach began?
I think it's because, well, I say it's a combination of both. One, working with TAAF and other leader organizations around the country, because of all the reports that have been out there, we're sharing and amplifying the message and the data, the information about our API community. And that's happening more and more. I think now there's a lot of information out there for others to read and learn about. For us as an organization, a data format organization, we have something that's called Change Insight every year that we actually survey our communities in Chicago and across the country. And we share not just with the API community about poverty rates, employment, unemployment rates, transportation, English efficiency, and so on, but we're able to share it throughout the entire country and the elected official. Many people don't know, right, that our Asian American community, 65% of our Change Insight respondent surveyed live in poverty, right? And so when we're able to share this message, this data to our elected official, to our counterparts, our allies in the Black and Brown communities, they see, wow, we have the same struggle. We have the same data points. So how can we work collectively together to remove some of these struggles, including anti-Asian hate?
That's a profound statistic. 65%, you said, right?
Yes, and we can share more of that data too. Yes.
I mean, in New York, the numbers have slightly changed, but the recent numbers, it was like 24% of API New Yorkers live under the poverty line. That's 1 out of 4, right? I mean, that's not a number that most people are familiar with. But I often said when I covered these anti-Asian incidents, so many of them were out there late at night collecting cans. And so then I would, further that conversation as to why were they out there at 3 a.m. collecting cans? This is the answer, right? This is the part of the story that we have to get out there. Paul, thank you for that. Ju, Hope Against Hate. There's so much with Hope Against Hate. Quickly, if you can give our viewers here a quick, recap on what Hope Against Hate is, some of the positive impacts of that, and how you think it can be replicated nationally.
Sure. So as a research and advocacy organization that has about 70 nonprofits in our network here in New York, we led the response to anti-Asian violence in New York in early 2020 because we were hearing from so many of our member and partner organizations that their clients were being assaulted, they themselves were being assaulted, and our small business owners that we were serving also said, I'm so afraid to keep my doors open. So we ended up launching our Hope Against Hate campaign as a way to provide immediate street safety, just because that didn't exist. Going to the police was not really a solution for many of our community members, just because of language access, and also they were not getting the support that they needed. So it's been established for the past few years as a way to provide immediate safety, but over time it's become a way that we can actually provide longer term safety. So our 30 plus groups that we fund across New York State, they provide a spectrum of services to support, like wraparound support for impacted community members. That could look like in-language safety trainings. It looks like victim support services, including, Julia, like to your point, much of it is mental health related services that people are seeking. It's training volunteers to provide protective accompaniment. And it's also creating youth programming to help youth know they're not alone, and how do we help them address some of the online and in-person violence that they are experiencing during this really terrible time. So it's been amazing to create a really strong network of these organizations that our people are using to say, hey, if you need X, Y, and Z services in this neighborhood, in this language, I have a partner organization that I can refer you to. So it's become over time. And then I think, Julia, to your point, and Paul, to your point, things had to happen. There had to be an intentional investment, and it took time to get us here. I think people wanted immediate safety right away, but if you're trying to build that sort of safety infrastructure for what is sadly a long-term hate violence crisis, you actually need to make that investment and make sure that services are integrated in existing services already. So it's been really illuminating, and we've had some groups that, you know, whether they're South Asian serving, they end up also serving the East Asian community. So we also have organizations that have built that infrastructure of safety and then can show up for each other as this hate violence evolves but continues to impact the Pan-Asian community here in New York. So as a model of potential replication, we've spoken to different cities across the state and also outside of the US of how can aspects of this be something that is tailored to each city. Maybe safety training is something that's more needed. Maybe it's actually training volunteers to provide protective accompaniment presence. Maybe it's actually mental health services that are not always clinical in nature, right? So something I appreciate, Julie, that you said, it's not just the fact that people are just coming in seeking mental health support in terms of therapy, right? I think one of the things that we felt really good about is that we had already invested and partnered with 4 to 6 mental health partners providing mental health services prior to COVID. And obviously they were well positioned to not only serve as referrals, but be the hub for where people could go when they were being impacted. So these were not only victims, right, of people who had survived assaults, but were people who were impacted by secondary trauma of just witnessing just the unending incidents that were happening across the city and the states. And New York, and CeFaan, you talked about poverty, right? We talked before COVID, where as a research organization, we saw that poverty was 25% before COVID. We're now looking at 36% post-COVID. And among the senior population, Paul, that you referenced, that poverty rate is much higher. We are the poorest senior population here in New York, which means that people have to go to food pantries or meal programs to eat every day. But we've heard from senior serving member organizations that people have gone without food because they're afraid of being assaulted. But now that they, in some ways, feel they don't have a choice because they have to eat, they've said, I'm not afraid to lose my life if I have to go out and get food. And that shouldn't have to be a choice between getting food and also being able to live their lives. So that's a really heartbreaking narrative that I'm hearing from all these different partners. And we need to be able to provide safety so that that's not a choice they have to make on a daily basis.
I want to touch on 2 things and come back to mental health in a second. You talked about the public safety part of this, the component, and obviously every different city has different police departments, and so it's different. But you said something that doesn't escape me. We all know, we talked about ad nauseum, why AAPI community members have some reluctance to call law enforcement. That said, you know, you mentioned a language barrier. I mean, the NYPD is the most diverse law enforcement agency in the nation, and they readily have 18 languages and translators available. Is that not enough? I mean, where's the gap where even in the most robust, diverse police department, we're still having that disconnect?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different factors that I don't think is necessarily unique to Newark, but I do think that the kind of education and training around how to address anti-Asian violence is still something that needs to be developed for law enforcement. And I think prior to that, there is really mistrust of government agencies, right? Because of interactions that happened, but obviously post the Trump administration, a lot of that trust was eroded. And I think we met recently with community leaders and city leaders, and we pointed that out, the fact that people often want to go to law, and even for them to get to a point where they can report, because there's stigma, there's language barriers, there's a host of barriers, so that by the time people say, I'm going to report, they have mustered up this courage to do it. And they're often met with resistance. Is this really a hate crime? Sort of doubts about what constitutes a hate crime. We know the definitions are complicated, but right. Just to support them, even if it's not a silent assault, the fact that people who look East Asian, South Asian, Muslim, Arab, they're being disproportionately targeted. Do things have to be uttered for them to get that kind of support, to be able to connect to victim support services, et cetera? So language, yes, but oftentimes we've also heard accounts beyond the sort of discouraging of reporting, they're not connected to the right language that they need. So we've had, Korean community members being connected to Mandarin interpreters. It's just, there's a level of cultural competence that we still need to develop to make sure that law enforcement can really support our community members the way they really need.
So quick follow-up here. It's safe to say that even though every law enforcement department has different issues, they all sort of seem to share a little bit of a struggle with catching up with this. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I think that's why partners just like us on the call and our Hope Against Hate partners are so critical if we want to actually provide safety. We have to create alternate models.
Let me ask you a follow-up to that. So we all know that, when budgets are lean, the initiatives like DE&I initiatives are first out the door, right? Let's just be honest about that. Similarly, I would ask you, are you finding that, when you have cities with budget crises and they start cutting police department budgets, this gets even more difficult, I would imagine, right? Like getting them up to speed with the very nuanced hate crimes as it is must be hard, but it must be harder now.
Yeah, I think we are especially concerned because of city and state funding cuts, right? There's a threat to potentially kind of having to pull down or not sustaining what's been built up over these past few years. So I want to say that these safety responses like Hope Against Hate campaign, it actually provides immediate safety around other emerging issues. There's a gun violence issue that actually some of our partners have been able to respond to because they were able to build up their ability to respond to violence as a whole. Online digital violence is another issue area that people are starting to tackle. So this defunding might be immediately we're saving costs, but you are actually risking lives, and the mental health impact that we've all alluded to on this call. We're in the midst of a mental health crisis that if you defund this really especially important work during this time of evolving and growing hate crisis, you're going to end up seeing so many other crises that could have been prevented by organizations like our partners, like the folks on this call who are trying their best to prevent more extreme, egregious incidents from happening.
Let me get Harman. I didn't forget about you, but I want to get this mental health thing with her real quick. So you also mentioned earlier young AAPI, and look, we talk ad nauseum about how AAPI is not monolithic, but I don't think we often talk about generationally the differences as well. So my question to you is, when you service the elderly, the older AAPI versus the youth, and quick statistic in my reporting, I stumbled on this a year ago or so, that the leading cause of death among youth in America is gun violence. The leading cause of death among AAPI youth is suicide. So the question to you is, what do you see as the major differences of what young AAPI need, maybe it's in the mental health space, versus the older?
Yeah, I wish we had our mental health partners on this call because I think they could really go into depth of that. But I think with our seniors, it really is around, and the fact that they are actually pursuing and seeking out clinical services during this time is really something that we hadn't seen before COVID. But I think with seniors, it's really just more around speaking to somebody, right? Being able to talk about not in terms of like mental health, but the stress and fear and things like that, especially not as an isolated incident, but related to real threat of food insecurity, right? All these poverty-related issues. But with our youth in New York, 90% of Asian kids have at least one immigrant parent, which means that most of our kids are growing up with at least English not being the predominant language in the household, right? So there's potentially not access to mental health services that they need. Some of the work that our partners have done is they've integrated mental health concepts into youth programming so that parents are more receptive to their kids receiving some kind of support. If you say your kid needs therapy, they're very resistant. A lot of our partners have talked about community education for both youth and parents, but our youth actually need access on a day-to-day basis. So after school programming, identity development, talking about how to recover post-COVID, our partners have been so innovative in making sure that that access gets expanded across their programming to make sure that our kids have safe places to address what they are experiencing and are able to create supportive spaces for youth as peers to be able to talk at length about the support that they need.
Yeah, that's interesting because I was thinking about our elderly and then, teenagers. But to your point, the teenagers' parents are the ones that have to sign off on this, right? And so maybe when I say older, I should have been a little more specific. It sounds like there's a conflict there even that maybe some of the parents are not as open to it. Do you find that the youth are wanting this, are eager for this, they're more open to it, or is that also still a stigma among teenagers?
I think we've heard it's a lot of lack of knowledge. So even for them identifying what does anxiety, what does depression look like, for them, they've never been exposed to that kind of education. So a lot of our mental health partners and just overall for Hope Against Hate partners working on with youth populations, a lot of the education has just kind of been from scratch, right? So they want to make sure that kids have the language to understand what they're experiencing and then be able to know where to go if they need that support. So I do think that cultural competency piece has been so critical across all our mental health services.
And it sounds like there's still resistance from the parents' generation. So how do you guys combat that?
I would love Julia to talk a little bit more about this, but I think the education, that's what our groups are doing, is They also take a cultural competency approach to parenting classes to say, how can you do X, Y, and Z that will actually support your kids to maybe perform better academically. So they use these sort of culturally appropriate and non-threatening ways to provide that education to parents so that they are open to their kids receiving those different types of support.
Interesting. We'll bring Julia back into this, but Harman has been waiting here for a while now. I want to bring you in here. Look, people often ask me, was I surprised when this explosion of anti-hate happened? And my answer is simply no, because obviously I lived this life and lived in this body, and it didn't just start in 2020, as I said, but also because we all saw it happened post 9/11. You just have to look less than 20 years ago, 2 decades about, to see that what was about to happen when COVID and the pandemic happened. So let me simplify the question for you, Harman. Have we learned anything?
Yeah, I think you really gave the answer at the top, right? One of the most important things that we learned is that hate in America is systemic and approaches to hate need to be comprehensive. And so, like you said, the hate for the Sikh community did not start on 9/11. We can go back to the Bellingham riots and early Sikh immigrants to the country to see where the hate originated. And just like for the broader AAPI community, hate obviously didn't start with COVID-19. And so the way we've approached the work of the Sikh Coalition is that we need comprehensive strategies built with broad coalitions to really address the issues at play. And so just for quick context, right, Sikh Coalition, we were founded in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. We have 5 key programmatic areas to address the issues of hate. And so we have a legal team, policy, community development, education, and communications. The reason we have program areas that span broadly across those different parts of our work is we feel like that is what is needed to actually comprehensively address hate and the issues that we're seeing take place, both in regards to the Sikh community and also the broader AAPI community. And so I'll just give you a quick example of how we kind of deploy that in terms of our work. So for years, we've been working in California to advance legislation that would not just protect the Sikh community, but also broader marginalized communities as well. And so last year, that included a hate crime bill that would require every law enforcement agency across California to adopt a policy with detailed specific protocols to actually identify, respond to, and report hate crimes. We were also simultaneously supporting a bill that would increase inclusive education in the state of California. We were also sponsoring a bill that sought to ensure religious minorities in California's detention centers were able to exercise their freedom of religion without having to have, with being able to have accommodations for grooming, clothing, and headwear. And so supporting those bills, right, it's a pretty broad list of bills that we were supporting. All of that we felt was what was necessary to actually address some of the root causes of hate and discrimination against the Sikh community and other marginalized communities. And our support of all of those bills was really built on all of our key program areas playing a part in it. And so, our advocacy team analyzed the bills, they put in amendments, met with legislators, built up a lobbying strategy. Our legal team, based on their years of experience working with victims of hate, actually informed what sort of policies we wanted to advocate for. Our community development team worked directly with Sikh community members in California, going to Sikh houses of worship, getting them to sign on and support this legislation. Our media and comms team building out a broader strategy that we can use to really build a narrative and story about the community to bring these issues forward. And so the reason I share all of that is we really think that hate and addressing hate cannot be addressed in a vacuum. We don't think any policy, campaign, or strategy can really be deployed without thoughtful consideration of all of the other parts of the work that has to go into it. And so, for us, that's really thinking through what are the unintended consequences of legislation that we're supporting on other communities, right? How are we able to bring in other folks, both within the AAPI umbrella, but also the broader civil rights umbrella into the work that we do, and actually build strong coalitions that support this legislation or support a policy change or support some sort of narrative change that we're hoping to actually address. And so, this dates back to the early founding of the Sikh Coalition. One of the first things the Sikh community and the Sikh Coalition decided very early on is to say, hey, the Sikh community will not respond to acts of hate by saying we are not Muslim. And the reason we made that decision and the Sikh community broadly made that decision is the understanding that this idea of mistaken identity was just wrong framing, wrong framework, and that no community should be dealing with hate. And so that early decision to say, hey, we're not going to take that stand and take that framework is still how we kind of operate today. And it's a lesson that we'd love to share with our partners because when we're advocating for Sikh to be included in social studies standards, we refuse to do that if it means the Black community is going to be excluded from social studies standards. we're not in this to be a race of who's going to be included and excluded. We have a broad vision of what we want for this. And in the same way, if we're looking at book bans, we need to be able to communicate to our communities how do book bans that are broadly being framed as impacting the LGBTQ community, impacting all of our communities, and why is this an issue they should care about?
Of all the years I've been familiar with your organization, I wasn't even aware that you had this policy from the outset that you don't say we're not Muslim. And I think that's smart because frankly, the perpetrator doesn't care, right? Like at the end of the day, the perpetrator assaulting a Sikh man or a Muslim man doesn't really care if you're Muslim or not. So that's an interesting lesson that I think we can apply across the board. We have to stop focusing on the things that are really not preventing this either way. Let me ask you this. This is a question from the Q&A, and this is a reminder to anyone in the audience. If you have a Q&A question, put them in the Q&A chat. I'll see them. We'll try to get some of these questions in. Your organization has been around for a long time, unfortunately. What has it been like for the community to live, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, if this is not accurate, live in sort of this constant fear? Do you normalize that? Have you gotten over it? Or is this still a thing decades later? What's that like?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's multiple parts to this. The first thing I would say is the Sikh community has this concept of Chardi Kala, and that's eternal optimism, even in the face of adversity. And so I think many in the community would not say this is necessarily a state of fear. It's a state of we need to respond and we need to be able to advocate and fight for our rights, and for all communities to have basic rights addressed as well. And so absolutely, right, we're in really difficult times right now. We are in an election year where we know rhetoric at the top matters, and the ways in which our communities are talked about directly, we know anecdotally, impacts the legal intakes that we have in hate and violence and bullying that we see happening in our communities. We also know geopolitical conflicts have a direct impact on all of our communities here domestically. And so there is a lot happening all at once that is impacting our communities. And I think more than ever, the community that we're working with is energized and wants to do more. And really what I would say is what they're really interested in and what folks are fully behind is this proactive work in the education field to say, hey, we need to actually start where hate is beginning. And that's children being taught to either dismiss, not understand, or exclude folks of different communities. And so we've invested heavily in our education work as a proactive measure to address hate. That's
an interesting point. And there's actually a question in the Q&A about K through 12 education, and maybe I'll bring Julie in for that as well. Before I jump around here though, something I guess maybe if you can impart on us some wisdom. Nationally, you were talking about how the coalition has been strong. Unfortunately, because you're the elder in the room, you've been around longer than some of these other groups. Any advice for other nonprofits, other groups out here, just to achieve that sustainability? Because you guys have been doing this for a long time now. What's the key to just longevity in this space? Yeah, I really think it goes back to coalition building and community development, right? I think it is absolutely urgent for us to do the work that we do with our communities walking lockstep with us. I think if there's a disconnect between where the community is and where you are as a civil rights org, there's a lot of challenges, right? Sometimes that means we have to push community members. Sometimes it means we have to pull them. Sometimes it means they need to pull or push us as well, but we have to be in regular contact with the communities that we are advocating for. And then beyond that, I think it's so critical that we're building big coalitions, big tents, because the issues impacting our communities, again, like I said, cannot be viewed within silos. And the only way we're going to be able to sustain the movements that we're all a part of is if we are actually sharing best practices, strategies, thoughts, ideas. And this is one of the ways that we hope to be doing that. Okay, thank you, Harman. I'll come back to you too. Julia, let's bring you back in here. We had an audience Q&A question about K through 12 educators, just API youth. What do you find, and this sort of dovetails into the other question that we left off on, right? The mental health component. What often do you find the API youth, the differences that they may face in terms of what they need from older API?
Yeah, I do think that there's a lot of intergenerational differences. And so for a lot of our older sort of API patients and population, there it is around social isolation. And so that is why, we've established this community healing unit that really spans sort of the services in terms of victim support, violence prevention interventions, but also we have this thing called lay mental health counseling, where really it is about building trust on what are your immediate needs, whether it's social isolation, it could be about food, it could be about, just fixing something that was broken in your home due to a crime. So I think it is about building that trust. We had a tragic homicide case where, we provided intensive care to 3 generations. It was a teenager, an aunt, and a grandmother over a period of a year. And we know that there's so much stigma in our community. And so it wasn't easy to bring the family members together. They were very resistant. But really, again, it's about building the trust.
All three of them.
And so, yeah, building that trust, because in some ways there's a family unit, right? When we look at how it impacts across generations. And so through that trust building with the family, we were able to get them financial assistance that they needed. And then eventually the mental health services, and then sort of systems navigation. But I think, the point is that there has to be sort of a multi-tiered approach to this because fear and trauma, really, they are directly linked to health and well-being. And a lot of data out there about anti-Asian racism and violence really tends to focus on the perpetrator behavior rather than the experience of the survivor. And so that's why when we design our initiatives, we're really taking this trauma-informed approach. So it focuses on the survivor's needs. And then how do we reduce victim blaming and really focus more on health and healing? So again, we live in this society and a system where the victim has to prove that you are hurt. And that in itself is a whole other, re-traumatizing thing that folks have to go through. I think we have to recognize that. We have to redesign our systems, again, to be more survivor focused.
Julie, I want to side note commentary, something you just talked about. You checked the mainstream media earlier, and as a member of the mainstream media, I will say this. You are correct. Often these stories focus on the perpetrator. During my coverage, and I profiled close to 100 victims, I often never mentioned the perpetrator. And believe it or not, took a lot of heat, even from AAPI members, saying that I was giving cover or, ignoring racial tensions. But in fact, what I was doing is my part as a journalist, and I'll just sort of give this commentary here, is that I felt this was a moment to tell our story. It didn't matter to me who perpetrated this person. Hate is hate. I don't care what it looks like. And frankly, there's no explanation for it. I don't need to know motive, right? We know the motive. You hate. What I thought was important, was lacking in the narrative, was what is our story? What is our experience? So I often told stories that went 2 minutes and didn't even touch who the perpetrator was. So I agree with you, and I'm trying to do my part here. I think we need more of that. Now, with that said, another fantastic question came from the Q&A. I'm going to bring Paul into this and Ju into it as well. And I got a separate question for Harman if we have time after that. Paul, let's start with you. The question was, I sort of unpacked between the younger AAPI, the older. There's a question about between AAPI American-born and immigrant AAPI. Now, that's a great question because clearly there are different different needs, different fears. In your experience, what has it been like serving those 2 different communities, American-born versus immigrant? What's that been like?
It's a little challenging because the two have different life experiences and different life expectations. But we shouldn't separate them. They're young people who need support when they're experiencing, Asian-born and non-Asian, American-born and non-American-born. Hate is hate, right? So they're experiencing hate at school, be it cyberbullying or on the playgrounds or in the classroom. The perpetrator sees the student as Asian American, and they don't know if the student is Asian-born or not Asian-born.
Which, by the way, what bound all of us in 2021, right? Suddenly, it didn't matter if you're Filipino, Japanese, Korean, young, American-born. We were all getting whacked.
That's right. That's right. And so what we've done here, through an anti-hate center, is that we created a program called CLASS, working with the university, working with the student body, the faculty members, because we have reports from the university, from international students and American-born students who are also experiencing hate on campus. And then off of that, we built peace circles for our young children here at CASL. So they're working together. But in regards of seeing different students from American born and not American born, the perpetrator doesn't see that difference at all.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Drew, we talked about living in fear. Let's get to the solution. How do we live without fear moving forward?
I feel like you asked me the hardest question, CeFaan. I would like to invite others to, yeah, but I think that I will just kind of go back to what all of us were saying around coalition building and making that very intentional. And I think Sikh Coalition is an example of how it doesn't happen overnight. People often want overnight answers, and that's not going to happen. I think the idea of even divides happening existing between generations and divides existing between communities of color, finding that common ground and figuring out how to relationship build and create an investment in each other is really the only way forward. So I really appreciate organizations like Sikh Coalition who offered up their learning at the time during this crisis when all of us were doing it for the first time. I would even say our Hope Against Hate campaign, when we first created that plan, it had input from Black, LGBTQIA, and Latinx communities that had always created and relied on alternate systems of safety. So there has been idea sharing, there has been resource sharing, and our Hope Against Hate campaign partners have been extremely generous in supporting other partners and building up their work, because we realize it's not a siloed issue. There's so many things. I mean, Paul, you're talking about poverty. Julie, you're talking about solidarity building, and we're across the country from each other, but we're experiencing the same challenges. So even a panel like this has been really heartening to hear the kind of work that's happening. So I think staying humble and realizing that we can't make it a side issue, something that we do as an afterthought, but really centralizing it and making a through line in all our existing areas of services to make sure that it continues to stay a priority not waiting for the next crisis to happen. Because as we know, the elections this year, everyone's preparing for another surge of violence that may happen around in the months leading up to it. So we want to make sure that folks are prepared. Someone had asked the question of how do I make sure that I can be a part of the solution versus sort of passively waiting. Everyone can be a part of the solution. Communities, sharing community, building relationships. Some folks in our community have created walking clubs to show up and be like, I can walk with you because I know that you don't feel safe. There's very micro hyper local solutions that can be created, but also can be as high level up as like policy and advocacy. So I think all of us can play a part in creating a sense of safety across our communities.
Yeah, definitely true. Okay, Harman, I'm going to come back to you, but this question I'm going to ask Harman, I want all of you to sort of answer this. You just talked about it as well, kind of a round robin with a few minutes left. Without getting political, the fact is, it looks like we're heading into a repeat presidential race from 4 years ago. And again, without being political, we know what's going to happen with the rhetoric. With that said, again, starting with Harman, sitting here right now, looking at the next several months ahead and what we think it's going to bring, how are you bracing for yourself? How are you preparing for this? What does your organization need more of? If you can sort of try to answer that in 30 seconds or something like that, so we can go around the room here. Harman, you first.
Yeah, I would say most directly, right? We're engaged on get out the vote work, and that obviously is nonpartisan. But the idea behind that is ensuring members of our community know that they should be engaged in this electoral process and should be paying attention to what is happening in the broader ecosystem. And then beyond that, right, a lot of this is narrative change. A lot of this is what sort of messaging are we going to allow about our communities, and how does that messaging then fester and really build really dangerous narratives about who we are. And so, we're preparing on that front as well of how do we address this. And frankly, from the Sikh Coalition perspective, right, there have been several folks who have run for office now that are of South Asian background. And there's been, really dangerous rhetoric about some of those folks, spread by some of those folks. And we have to really navigate that and address some of those tensions and figure out how do we actually go about ensuring that the rhetoric at the top does not impact our communities, because we know that it does all too often.
Is it a little bit easier because we've had a run at this before, and that's weird to say, but this time we're not getting caught off guard. The simple fact is it was raised by you and by Drew just now, like this is coming, right? Does that make this a little bit easier? I don't know if that's the right word. Well, better practiced at it, unfortunately. Maybe that's an unfortunate way to look at it, but is there some benefit from having gone through this 4 years ago?
I hope so. I just hope it doesn't go the other way of folks kind of being desensitized to this, because we do know it's going to come. And the moment we allow this to be normalized rhetoric about our communities, it's going to be much harder for us to then combat this down the road.
Excellent point, Julia. Let me pick up from where Harman just left off. Is that a real fear heading into this election cycle, that there's some desensitizing, some normalization, that people are just not going to care as much because we survived last time and here we are?
I think the threat actually that we're hearing from our partner groups, our partner organizations, is that people are not even planning to go out. So to Harman's point, get out the vote, helping, supporting folks feel that their voice still matters, that they're not a victim of their circumstances. But also our partners that have been doing work in the safety training space is creating safety planning for their clients, right? Instead of, I don't know if we're prepared better, but I guess that there's a sense of we need to prepare ahead of time versus like just being blindly optimistic. So I do feel as a community here in New York, we're a little bit more equipped to be able to respond, knowing the challenges that lay ahead. But I also think that, yeah, we can't let our guard down. We can't be desensitized, and we need to integrate encouraging folks to go out and vote while also ensuring safety for them in doing that.
Julia first, and then Paul, same question to you guys.
Yeah, I think we have to really leverage and build on what we have established so far, because it's true. It's simply not easy to reverse sort of decades of invisibility in the fight for, racial justice and also in anti-Asian hate and violence. And so, we've had a moment where there's been a tremendous focus and now it's kind of, diminishing, but we have to create that long runway, and so if it gets through the partnerships, what Ju was saying, we're all here on this call. It's about the movement building. It is about leveraging the investments that have been made, but we also have to continue to building that infrastructure for systems change, which I think, Harman, you're talking about the advocacy. And so we have to strengthen our rapid response systems. We need to connect and build. And in our state here in California, there was an investment by our state around anti-hate. So how do we really build that and then sort of build more capacity for all the organizations throughout our country? Because I think we do have to advance that public health and policy agenda around this to reduce the violence and address all the gaps that we are seeing. So from a local level to the state and then to the national level, because we have to bring more resources to our underserved communities overall.
Any fears that people are more checked out this year? I mean, to be honest, it's a lot to handle. And for some people, checking out is kind of a survival mechanism. Is that a shared concern heading into this year, that people are just desensitized?
I think that there is a fear, but I think that's where we really do have to work with our communities to say, this is actually, you are needed to come forward and we need to hear your voice. And so I think, again, we have to make sure that there is that fear, and how do we address it? And again, that's where our community healing unit and initiative comes through in terms of being able to address that from a health and healing perspective. We have to recognize there is a component of that. So I think as we move into this, we just have to kind of really keep very sort of focused on sort of what's ahead. And then again, expand and build our partnerships, not just within our own Asian community, but beyond.
Yeah, well said. Okay, Paul, you get the last word on this one. Same question to you. Looking ahead, this election cycle, what are we expecting?
I think it goes to the pillars of TAAF. For us as an organization and the coalition, TAAF's pillars, of response and prevention and protection is really critical for this election. As an organization, for us in the coalition in Chicago, we got to make sure that if an incident happens, we are there on the ground to respond, to support the victims, be it whatever it is. And that's really critical with the comprehensive service and the coalition that we have here in Chicago. I think prevention and protection is really critical also, is that we continue to educate, not just wait towards election day, right? Is now, and to educate and to provide workshops to teach and educate our community their rights, but also for them to be more active and engaged in responding and sharing, if there is an incident, for us to report it and to work with law enforcement. And also,
get the story out to you. Let's not forget that.
Yeah. So I think those are really critical. Going back to, again, with TAAF's pillars, for us as an organization and the coalitions that we work with in Chicago, being responsive, being preventive, providing all the workshops we can for our communities. And if there is an incident, connect with the right people, right law enforcement to protect our families and community.
Okay, well said. Look, we filled an hour with ease, which just tells me how much more we can go with this. I learned a lot. Hopefully our audience learned something today. Truly, again, grateful for all of you guys and your time. Grateful for TAAF and everything that TAAF does. Wouldn't be here without them. Everyone knows on this Zoom what TAAF is, how to get in touch with TAAF, all the resources. I'm sure TAAF will continue updating all of this great information as we go along. It's going to be, as we all said, an interesting year ahead. Things don't change overnight, so keep fighting the good fight. Again, it was a pleasure to be with you guys, taking an hour out of your days. I know you're all busy to sit down with us, all boring talking heads. Hopefully you guys learned something. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll be on another Zoom and a panel soon, sometime soon. Thank you guys.